Hey everyone, today I'm going to be showing you how to create animated tiles in Godot 4 using the tile sets and tile maps with a relatively simple piece of code attached to your tile map. Okay, we'll get started. So what you want to start with, and I'll link a video in the description on kind of how to get here. It explains all these bits and pieces, but in Godot 4, you need at least a 2D node with a tile map attached to it, a timer attached to that tile map. You then want to import your tile sets here, and you can have any number of them. You then want to create layers. Um, I have 4 here, so I could show them here. So animated ocean, animated land, static land, and animated rivers. Um, and you want to, on the layers, have a keyword because as you can see here, these are all using that same tile map, but these are animated, whereas these in the middle of the island are not animated. And that is based on whether or not it's on a layer with your keyword. And in my case, my keyword is just animated. Okay, so get started here. First thing, we just need the ready function, and then I need to actually disconnect this node here. Connect it. Okay. So first thing we need to do is actually from the tile map to the tile set, we need to see how many columns there are, because in this case we're working off the assumption that each row is a separate um, kind of tile that needs to be animated via changing to each column. And they're differentiated by atlas coordinates. And the code we're going to write is going to take into account if there are missing tiles here. So in this case, there's blank space. So tile of atlas coordinate 0, 0 is not being used. So it starts at 0, 1. And then for this river here, these on the side aren't being used either. Okay. So how we're going to do that is with 2 recursive functions that are called from the ready function. So I'm going to create a function of iterate tile row, and that needs to take in source tile set. Okay. This essentially what this is doing is it's going to start here at atlas coordinate 0, 0 and go and iterate through until it can find the first active row. The assumption here also is your sprite sheet of tiles that you want to animate is a rectangle. It's not some sort of like funky shape where certain rows are longer than the other. You could probably change the code to get that to work, or you could break up the sprite sheet. Okay. So we need if the input source tile set, and we're going to use the function hasTile. And that needs to take in a vector 2i. Or it could just be a vector, but it needs to be an integer. And we want to iterate over a counter, which I'm going to call j. And if it does have the tile, then it's done. It found the first row, and that's when it's going to call the next function, which is head column. And it needs to input that same source tile set. If it doesn't find it, it just needs to add 1 to the counter, go down to the next row, and call itself so that I can check again. There are other ways to do this. It doesn't have to be a recursive function. I'm using it like this just because it's relatively simple and condensed. This is only, 6 lines. So, and here I'm actually going to just create my var j. All right, create the iterate tile column. And I'm having trouble typing today. Okay, and this also needs to take in the source tile set. Now, for this case, it's kind of the opposite as before, where we were assuming there might be blank space at the top, and so it needs to keep going until it finds one. This, we're assuming it starts with one, and then it will continue on until it can't find any more. Um, so it will go to Atlas coordinate 7, and then it will try to go to Atlas coordinate 8, not find anything, and stop there. And that will uh, tell us how many columns there are, which is how many frames are in each of these. Okay, so source tile set. Use the has tile again. And that's just a Boolean, so I don't, with Godot, at least, I don't have to tell it whether or not it's true or false. Or if I don't tell it whether or not it's true or false, it'll just assume the if statement means if it's true. Okay. If it does find it, it needs to keep going and iterating. So we can create another counter here. And then it's going to return to itself again, like the previous one. And put that source tile set. If it keeps going, it's not continuing. It's going to return I. And all I is the counter for the number of columns. So that in this case will be 8. Okay. Here up in our ready function, first we need to get how many source tile sets we have, which are these. So in this case, I have 5, starting with ID 0, going to ID 4. And we need to iterate over each of these. This code is assuming that your number of columns might be different between each of your textures that you're using. So say if this river, if for some reason I wanted to use the arrow in the animation, it doesn't make any sense, but sure. Then this would have 9. And we want to account for the fact that we want to animate these all correctly, but still use every frame of animation, even if they're different widths. So first, I'm going to set a variable. And because we're using, we've got the script on the tile map itself, I'm going to reference self, tile set. So we're going from the tile map to the tile set, and then we need to get source count. And that's just how many of these are. Columns. Okay, so what I'm creating here is I'm going to create an array. Yes, there. I'm going to create an array that I can use then to store that value for each of those columns, and it's just going to be an empty array to start. And then based on the number of columns, we're going to resize it. Now we're going to iterate over each of the tile set sources or those textures. So create a for loop, starting at 0 and going to the total number of sources. At the beginning of each of these loops, we want to reset the counters, 0. And then because our iterate tile column returns the I, which is the columns, we can just set our variable. Oh, I forgot my colon. Never forget your colon, kids. That's a terrible thing. and it's for each of the loops. So iterate. We want to call row first because row calls column. And then we want to input the tile set that we are currently working on. All right. Too few arguments. Get source. Oh, forgot that. Okay, so this then inputs the source that we're working on, and then it will output that number and store it in the array. Okay, now we are going to use the timer and create one more function that will actually um, basically set the frames per second between that determines how often these frames are updated, and then the actual code for updating each of these. Okay, so first thing I'm going to do is create a function here called new tiles. Okay, and all timer timeout is going to call is that function. At the beginning of new tiles, we want to set that timer and restart it. So now this is recursive essentially. The timer times out. It calls this function. It sets that new duration. It updates the frames for all the tiles. And continues on and on. Now I've created a new variable here called duration. For ease of for readability, I'm going to also create an FPS, but you can't really put FPS as this duration. That doesn't make any sense. The duration is the time between each of the frames here, not the actual frames per second. In order to go from FPS to time between frames, you need to do just a tiny bit of math, which is going to be duration is equal to 1 over FPS minus 1. The reason it's minus 1 and not 1 over FPS is because if I want 5 frames per second, I need to have 4 durations between each of those. So it needs to be 0.25 4 times to put 5 frames in 1 second. So if I want 10 FPS, I actually need 5 spaces of time between those. So that duration is there. And then we need to call new tiles at the beginning when it's first ready so that we can get it going. Otherwise, it'll never actually start. Why is it not happening? Oh, I need an onReady variable. Need to get the timer. I could just call timer directly because I'm only doing it in this one line, but have it. Okay. So for the meat of this is this particular function. We're going to start with a for loop. It's going to be the range of self.getLayersCount. So we're starting with how many layers do we have, and then we're iterating over each of those layers. So in my case, I have 4 layers. So we're going to check the tiles on each of these layers through this for loop. And at the start of this, we want to check name, the current layer we're working on. We need to see if it's got our keyword in it. And in my case, that keyword is animated. -1, always forget. Okay. So what this is essentially saying is if it does not find this, so if if find n is equal to -1, that means it didn't find the keyword in the string that's the layer name. So we only want to animate animated ocean, land, and rivers. We want to ignore static land. And the keyword could be whatever you want. It just made sense to make it animated. And then continue will break it or break it out of the loop of P3 in this case, or P2 actually. And then it will continue on at the next. Okay, now I need to create a variable, tiles in tile set. And that is going to get all of the tiles on that layer that are in the world. Okay. Now we want to loop over each of those tiles, check what atlas coordinates it is, and then move to the next atlas coordinates to then go to the next frame. So it'd be 0, 2. If it started at 0, 2, it'd go to the 1, 2, etc., etc. And then we will include an if check that will essentially say if it's equal to 7, or if it's equal to the columns minus 1, because there's 8 columns total, but it's atlas coordinates of 7, then it needs to restart and go back here. You could have a different bit of logic if you wanted your animation to ping pong, if you wanted to get it to 7 and then go to 6 and then 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, 0. I'm having this because of this sprite sheet. It's set up to go to the end and then restart back. So a new for loop, a 0, and then we're checking. So this gives us an array of all of the tiles that it found. And so we just want to see the size of it because we want to loop over every single one of those tiles. I'm going to create a new variable here called step, which all that is literally, 0 to 1, 2, etc. Okay, now we want the actual code to set that cell. Now, most of the information for the cell that we're checking, we want to keep it the same. But set cell is going to ask us to check the layer, which we're going to keep as P. That's also going to ask the current position of that cell. So if you wanted to move it or something, you could change it, but we just want to keep that the same. And that information is contained within this array we created earlier. It actually lists out the locations there that it needs. And then it needs the source. Oh, hey, that popped up. All right. So now it needs to get the source ID here. We want to keep that the same. And that function also needs the layer and location. Okay. And then finally, we want to give it the new atlas coordinates. Okay. And that atlas coordinates is just going to be a new variable here. And that needs to be a vector to I. And we want to iterate over the x and keep the y the same. So first we're going to get the atlas coordinates of the tile in x. And then we're going to add our step. And then we're going to do the same thing here, except it's going to be y. And we're going to keep that the same. Okay. And then finally, we want that check for if it's at the end, reset. If cell atlas coordinates. Now we need the layer and position. We're checking that x value, and if it's equal to the tile set's columns. And now, because we're checking over layer, but tile set's columns is an array based on the source, and those could be used interchangeably. You can have a, I could use ocean water for whatever reason. I could use that tile set on multiple layers, but we're checking over layers. So we need to check that source and the column width there. So we need to get the cell source ID to make sure we're checking that properly. And then we want to do -1 because if it's at the end, there's 8 columns, but it's the seventh and the atlas coordinates. If it is equal to that, in my case, uh, for this particular loop of the frame, I'm going to have it set equal to the negative of this. And it's actually going to be +1 because we're starting at um, atlas coordinate 7, and we want to subtract or add -7 to get back to 0 instead of 8. Okay. I believe that is all of the code here. Now I'll put a break here for a time so you can skip to the end if you don't care about this. But I'm going to take a little bit of time. And oh, there we go. Oh, actually, I already have it set up. Okay. Never mind. I forgot that I had already set this up beforehand. Yeah, because I copied it over. Okay, so here I actually will, just for sake of completeness. So here, using the tile map, you essentially can click. You just go to tile map here. You go to whatever texture you want to use, and you can click, and then you make sure you're on the correct layer, and then you just drag around. Now, what's important, or actually a note rather, is if, for example, I have this. It'd be this. If I want to keep all of these cells all animating at the same time, I would want to use the same starting frame for each of these because they're all updated all at once. If I want in my case, maybe a coastline that waves and goes back and forth, what you can do in this code, it doesn't matter. They can start at different points. But say here, I can take this second frame and put it next to the one that has the first frame, do this here, and do this here. And so now when we run it and we get an error because I forgot to type var. Okay. Oh, why is this zoomed in? So I don't have a camera. There we go. Now if we run it, that's important. Okay, so you can see here now, based on the code we wrote, it's animating all of the tiles that are on the layers animate. And then what I was talking about before, so here, say this or this, they're all going in and out all at the same time. But because I set these cells up to start at different frames, now it looks like it's kind of waving a little bit. And I can do it more dramatic if I wanted it to be, say, opposites or something. Um, I can have one, this, oh, well, that's really opposite. This frame starts here and here. And so now it's going to be kind of a funky looking, goes back and forth like that. So you get any desired effect as long as it's kind of part of your sprite sheet. And that's it, really. Relatively simple piece of code. Thanks for watching along. I hope it was useful. If anybody has any suggestions on how to do this better, I'd love to hear it. Um, I do know that at least this to me feels a little unnecessary. I would have assumed that there would be um, a built-in method to determine the number of columns and rows. All I could find was a built-in method to determine the total number of rows, or I mean, sorry, total number of cells. So in my case, it's 140 because it's 8 columns and uh, 20 rows. And so I get 140 cells. That's not super useful if you're trying to animate and you need to, just use the number of columns to help you animate. So if anybody has a better way to do this, I'd love to hear it. If you learned something, leave a comment or a like or don't. I don't know. But I hope this was useful for to at least one person. And thank you, and have a good rest of your day and good time coding.